Hey everyone! For today's Halloween video, we're going to be making spooky sugar cookies. To make these, you're going to need self-raising flour, eggs, unsalted butter, granulated sugar, baking powder, salt, and then something for icing. So I've chosen to use a packet of instant royal icing, whereas you can use just icing sugar with a bit of milk or a bit of water and so on and so forth. That's completely up to you. The first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to leave your butter out to let it reach room temperature. I unfortunately left mine near a window, so it's half melted and half solid. So just if you're going to be making it on a Wednesday morning, take it out the Tuesday evening, leave it on a counter, cover it with a towel so flies don't get at it, and it'll just be room temperature. You're going to put your butter and your sugar in a bowl together, and then you're going to whisk them together and beat them together until they've made one uniform texture. This is best done with an electric mixer, but I've recently moved house and I have realised that I actually don't own an electric mixer. I was using my parents' one, so I don't have an electric mixer. So I just took quite a while to just beat the butter into submission with a spoon. When they're mixed, you're going to add your egg or eggs and you're going to mix it all over again. So the recipe for this is actually for one lot of cookies, but I've doubled it because I like them and I'm going to share them with my family and stuff when they come to visit. So I've doubled up the recipe, which is why there's 2 eggs in that, even though there was only 1 egg at the beginning. I'll write the recipe will be in the comments anyway. After that, you're going to add your baking powder, your salt, and you're going to start mixing in your flour bit by bit. When you're mixing in your flour, just make sure you're completely thorough and you mix it all in. You don't want lumps of flour in the middle of a cookie because it's dry, tasteless and horrible. This next part will vary and I don't know why it varies, but if you end up with a very dry mixture like I have here, you can see that it's kind of in little separate lumps. You can just squish it together. And if you squish it together, it turns out completely fine afterwards. I don't know if it's supposed to be all dry like this or if it's just something I've done wrong, because sometimes it comes up dry like this and sometimes it doesn't. So I'm not quite sure what the difference is when I'm making it. So if anyone who's more knowledgeable about baking knows that, please let me know. I would very much appreciate it. When it's dry, I tend to just kind of make several big lumps like this, and then I can turn it out onto my table or onto a board and I can knead it all together at that point. Another thing I didn't realise I was missing until it was a bit too late was a rolling pin. So I need to go buy a rolling pin. In the meantime, I had to use a jar of pasta sauce, so don't lean too hard on a jar that's made of glass, obviously, because you don't want to ruin your cookies and lose your fingers. Once you've kneaded it all together and you've rolled it out as best as you can, you're going to put it onto a baking tray on some parchment paper or baking paper, and you're going to put it into the fridge for at least 2 hours. So I left it for 3 just because I had other things to do, so I just left it, and then later on you can cut it out and start actually baking the cookies. When the dough's been chilling in the fridge for long enough, you can then take it out and you're going to grab any cookie cutters you have and take it off of the tray. If you don't have a specific cookie cutter for your dough, glasses work really, really well. So with a glass you can just make a circle cut and then you can decorate it whatever way you want. It's a circular cookie. No one's going to really mind the shape of it because it'll be tasty. I was feeling festive, so I ordered some cheap little Halloween themed cookie cutters off of Amazon. So I've got a pumpkin and a ghost, and I have a witch's hat, and there's a cat, and then I have a bat, and I love them very much. And there's also a weird kind of witch with a pumpkin head thing that I really don't like, so I didn't use it. I just don't like it. If you're using a cookie cutter, make sure there's a thicker end. That's the end that your hand goes on so that you don't slice yourself. So if you're putting pressure down onto it, you don't want it cutting into your fingers. So use the thicker end so that it's blunter, and the thinner, sharper edge is for cutting into the cookies themselves. If the dough is thin enough, you can just straight away start cutting out shapes. If it's not, then you can roll again at this point. If you've got a cookie cutter shaped like this, where it's kind of like a flat wire, don't do what I was doing here, where I was holding either end of it like a crab claw kind of pinch like this. Hold one edge when you're lifting it up, because what I was doing that I didn't realise was I was squishing it closed around the stem, and that's why it kept breaking off. So I don't know how I didn't do it the first time, but I successfully did it both of these times. So don't hold it like I'm holding it right now. Put it down like that, but then just hold one edge when you're picking it up, because I was unintentionally squishing the stem and causing it to break off. So if you've got anything that's a little bit more finicky or detailed like that, then just hold one edge of the cookie cutter. Because I'm using multiple different shapes instead of just the one, with the first batch I want to do like 1 or 2 of every single type, because that way when I cook them I can see whether or not they turn out correctly. So for example, this cat, if I was cutting out the cat and I cooked it and the tail turns all blobby and the legs are all weird, I don't want to make any more cats because obviously it's not going to work out properly. So I'm just going to try every single one of them with the first batch, and then after that I can decide what I'm going to do with the rest of the dough. When you've all your shapes cut out, you can remove all the dough from in between that you're not going to be using this time, and then that dough can be used in the next batch of cookies. You can just bundle it all back up again, roll it out, flatten it, and then use the cookie cutters to make more cookies. When you have them all separated from the spare dough, you can then put them on a baking tray lined with baking paper or parchment paper, and just make sure all the cookies are about 1 inch away from each other because they'll expand slightly when they're cooking and you don't want them to stick to each other. You're then going to pop them into a preheated oven at roughly 180 degrees Celsius for about 11 or 12 minutes. You'll know they're done when the edges are kind of a golden brown. These ones were left in for maybe a minute or two too long. You'd ideally want them to be a little bit lighter in the middle. Transfer these to a wire rack to cool, and then you could just put on your next batch of cookies. When they're all cooked, then you can leave them to cool entirely, and then you can start icing. It suited me best that I made these a bit later in the evening, which is why the lighting is different. So I said I'd leave them overnight to cool and I'd ice them in the morning. The following morning I decided to ice them with some instant royal icing because I just prefer the way it doesn't harden and become crunchy, it stays soft. I decided to make it according to the packet, so it said to add in the water first and then add in the powdered icing sugar mix bit by bit so that you can get the consistency that you want. When icing sugar cookies, you're going to want 2 types of icing. You're going to want a thicker icing for the border and a thinner icing to flood the inside to actually ice the cookie itself. This is roughly the texture of the icing I want to use as my flood icing, so my icing for the middle of the cookie. You can see when I drip it down that it kind of sits on top for a minute before it goes down into the rest of the icing to join it. So it's stiff enough that I can use it for my cookies, but it's not watery enough that it's going to just fall over the edge of the border. So I'm going to take about 3/4 of that to one side and then make my border icing. So for the border icing, I'm just going to add some more icing sugar to the already existing flood icing, and I'm going to look for a little bit of a thicker texture to this one. If it goes a little bit too thick, you can add in a little bit of water to soften it back up a bit. So this is the texture that I'm going to want for my borders. It's thick enough that it's not really just falling off the whisk, and it's sitting on top, not rejoining the rest, but it is soft enough that I can very easily mix it around. So that'll make a good border for the cookies. If you want to flavour your icing, so for example, I'm going to be using a little bit of lemon extract in this one, you add it to your flood icing, not your border icing, because the liquid is going to thin out the icing just a little bit more, and you want your border icing to be a good border. You don't want the flood icing to just be able to break through it and drip all over the place, which is something that you'd see a lot, especially when kids make cookies. If they're mixing up icing with just icing sugar and water, you find it'll just sort of spill off the cookies really easily, and ends up being really thin on the cookies, and there's not enough there, and the cookie ends up being too dry. So always add it to your flood icing, not your border icing, so that you can contain where the icing goes and what shape it stays in. You do not have to flavour your icing, you can just leave it being sugar if you so wish. I just like lemon, so I'm going to add lemon to mine. Once you're happy with your icing, whether it's flavoured or not, you're going to want to put it into icing bags and get ready to ice your cookies. Make sure to keep track of which bag is the flood icing and which bag is the border icing, because you do not want to mix those up. When you're ready to ice your cookies, place them on a baking tray. You can put something under them if you so wish. I just didn't because I found it easy enough to just clean a bare tray, because it's just sugar. It does wash off really, really easily, so I didn't want to waste the baking paper. Take your border icing and trace the outline of the shape of your cookie. You don't want to go at the very, very edge of the cookie. You're going to go about 1/2 centimetre in. What's that? Like 1/4 inch roughly. Just so that if it does slope down a bit, it doesn't fall off the cookie. Because you're not icing the very, very edge. You need somewhere to hold it, and you need to have room in case the icing does overflow just a little bit. Once you've completed the borders, you can just leave it for about 30 seconds to make sure they've firmed up enough, and then you're going to take your flood icing and you're going to go inside the cookie. So you don't need to fill every single little gap because this will spread fairly easily. Just try to go near enough to the edge without hitting the border and fill in the middle just very roughly. Then what you can do afterwards is you can take a toothpick and you can just sort of squiggle around and spread the icing into any gaps that were left behind. I didn't have a toothpick, so I actually used one of the spiky bits of the fork. What are they called? If it has 4, it's a fork. 3 is a trident. What are they? Spikes. Pokey bits. The spiky parts of the fork I used instead of a toothpick because I didn't have any toothpicks. So you can just use that to spread the icing around so that you get a completely smooth finish and no random lumps and no random gaps in your icing. I don't even have anything to say here. I was going to clip out this part, but I honestly just found it so satisfying moving the icing around so that they were like properly cleanly iced that I'm just leaving it in. I'm sorry, I just have to. Once you've finished icing them, you can then leave them in a fridge for about a half hour, an hour, just let them firm up a little bit, then take some of the spare icing, dye it black and give them 2 little eyes and a mouth, and there you go, you have ghost cookies completely finished and ready for eating. It'll be the exact same for any other cookies you're going to be icing, whether they're circles or spooky shapes or whatever. You use your border icing, fill it with the flood icing, and just, you can dye it different colours. I'd suggest food gel over food dye because it doesn't water it down. But that's pretty much the only thing you have to look out for. So that's it for this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next Halloween video.